Democracy can only function if criticism of the government and criticism of EU institutions is allowed. That is precisely the core of freedom of speech. That even opinions hardly anyone agrees with are protected as a fundamental right, especially opinions the government does not agree with. So far, we have only seen a handful of cases involving European journalists on the sanctions list. But this could spread like wildfire if it is not stopped.
Is this about using fear to force others in the population into complying in advance? Against the current, about the person.
Hello
and welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about. Since 2024, the European Union has imposed sanctions over expressions of opinion. This violates the principles of the rule of law and a ruling by Germany's Federal Constitutional Court. Professor Dietrich Murswiek, an expert in constitutional, administrative, and environmental law, now emeritus at the University of Freiburg, says, "Without freedom of expression, there is no democracy. And in this way, the European Union is undermining democracy." Professor Murswiek, what are these sanctions about?
Was hat es, Professor Murswiek, mit diesen Sanktionen auf sich?
Wie Sie gerade sagten, seit 2024
As you just said, since 2024, there has been a new sanctions regulation through which the EU says it wants to combat Russian subversion and destabilization efforts. The EU believes that Russia is engaging in hybrid warfare, and that hybrid warfare includes using propaganda and disinformation to influence EU member states and third countries in order to attack and undermine their internal order, internal security, and sovereignty, and to destabilize them. This applies in particular to Ukraine, but also to other countries that may be affected by and are affected by this kind of Russian influence. And now, individual sanctions are to be imposed in response. Individual sanctions are sanctions directed at specific people, as opposed to sanctions directed at a state. They are also distinct from economic sanctions. Individual sanctions mean that a person who is placed on the sanctions list, who is listed, as the technical term goes, may no longer enter an EU country or travel through EU countries. That person's assets are frozen. In other words, all accounts held at banks are blocked. The person can no longer withdraw money from an account, make transfers, and all credit or bank cards are blocked. So the person is cut off from their financial means. And on top of that, everyone else is prohibited from making money or economic resources available to that person. That means a sanctioned person is cut off from all financial and economic means of existence. So that is what a sanction means in practical terms. And of course, one can ask, why does the EU do something like that? The EU's justification is that it is not a punishment. In other words, according to the EU, no one is being punished for expressing an incorrect opinion. Rather, it is a preventive measure. Such sanctions are intended to put pressure on the person concerned so that they refrain from taking part in Russian subversion and Russian destabilization.
Who would be affected by this? How many people are we talking about?
Von Meinungsäußerungen, die sie macht und von denen die EU meint, dass sie dazu beitragen, dass Russland seine Subversion voranbringen kann.
Wer ist denn davon betroffen? Um wie viele Personen geht es?
Es sind seit Beginn dieses Sanktionsregimes.
Since this sanctions regime began in 2024, 79 individuals have been placed on the sanctions list so far. And of those 79, as far as I'm up to date, 6 are individuals. This is something entirely new, something that had not yet emerged under the previous sanctions. The sanctions lists, based on a different legal foundation, on older sanctions regulations, include well over 4,000 people whom the EU has already sanctioned. But in those cases, the justification was usually some form of involvement in Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
Gegen die Ukraine. Es ging aber nie Meinungsäußerungen.
But it was never about expressions of opinion. And now, for 2 years, expressions of opinion have been sanctioned. There are still relatively few people on the sanctions list, but for the first time, it includes citizens of EU member states as well. And that is extremely significant. It is especially significant because these sanctions, as I described them, have a much more intense impact on EU citizens than sanctions imposed on Russian citizens living in Russia.
Russische Staatsangehörige verhängt werden, die in Russland leben. Man muss sich mal vorstellen, wenn ein Russe...
Just imagine this. If a Russian is put on the list, lives in Moscow, and has no significant assets in the EU, it doesn't affect him much if he's no longer allowed to travel to the EU. Maybe he would have liked to vacation here, but that's something he can do without. He can vacation somewhere else. And if that person earns his money in Russia and has his bank accounts in Russia, then a sanction like that does not hit him hard. But for someone whose center of life is in an EU country, who earns their money here and works here, it is an incomparably harsher sanction.
Härtere Sanktion. Denn wer hier abgeschnitten ist,
because anyone who is cut off from their bank accounts here, anyone who can no longer earn money because the so-called prohibition on making funds available applies, is pushed back from what may previously have been a quite decent standard of living to mere subsistence level. The prohibition on making funds available means that no one may give money or other economic resources to the sanctioned person. They do not have to starve, because the sanctions authority in the country where the person lives can approve the release of assets up to the subsistence minimum. So the person affected can receive the absolute necessities for living at the level of social assistance with the approval of the sanctions authority.
Mit Genehmigung der Sanktionsbehörde, aber
But this form of sanctioning pushes the individual back down to the bare minimum for survival. It effectively amounts to a ban on practicing one's profession. Because if no one is allowed to give me money, regardless of the reason, then I can no longer earn a living through my profession. It is grotesque how the Council of the European Union argues in this context when this is raised against it in proceedings before the European Court. The Council argues that freedom of profession is not affected at all. The person concerned can still continue working as a journalist. And that is true. Yes, he can continue working as a journalist, but no one is allowed to pay him for it. But to practice a profession, you have to be able to earn money from it. That is, so to speak, inherent in the very concept of a profession. Of course, this is a de facto professional ban that comes with this sanction. Now, from a legal perspective, this is really the final step in a legal analysis. But we can say it right at the outset. It is in no way compatible with the principle of proportionality to impose such a severe sanction on someone because of statements they have made.
So
harsh in the case of Berlin journalist Hüseyin Doğru that his social circle is affected as well. Hüseyin Doğru is married. He has 3 children, 2 of them very young. His wife's bank account was also temporarily frozen. At present, his mother's account is frozen. It inevitably brings to mind the reintroduction of the Nazi-era practice of holding families collectively responsible.
So in some cases, the EU actually does something that could be described as guilt by association. Some sanctions regulations explicitly state that family members can also be put on the sanctions list if they benefit in any way from the sanctioned person. In the Doğru case, I don't know the details that well. I don't know whether the freezing of the accounts of Doğru's wife or his mother was ordered by the EU. After all, neither of them is on a sanctions list.
Die beiden Personen stehen ja nicht auf einer Sanktionsliste. Von daher vermute ich eher, dass die Banken das gemacht
So I would assume that the banks did this because banks are often afraid that they themselves could be committing a criminal offense by helping to circumvent sanctions. And circumvention may be suspected when money ends up in the account of a person close to the sanctioned individual, whether a spouse, mother, or friend, and is ultimately made available to that sanctioned person. For a bank, helping a sanctioned person evade sanctions can be an existential threat if it makes a mistake. And apparently, banks sometimes do far more than they actually have to, simply because they are afraid of doing something wrong.
viel mehr machen, als sie eigentlich machen müssten.
Then there would need to be documentation, proof that Fuzin Doru has accounts within his social circle.
Ja, also wie gesagt, ich weiß in dem Fall nicht.
Yes, as I said, in this case, I don't know who initiated it. If the bank did it on its own initiative, so to speak, out of fear, then he, or his wife, or mother has to take it up with the bank. Ultimately, though, the bank would have to prove that this is a case in which it would be justified.
Dass so ein Fall vorliegt, in dem es berechtigt wäre.
Earlier, you mentioned two alternatives. One naturally thinks that this kind of sanction amounts to a punishment. Now, the European Commission claims that it is a preventive measure. What do you make of that? Well,
was halten Sie davon?
Also, wenn es eine Strafe wäre, dann wäre es ganz einfach.
If it were a punishment, then it would be very easy to say that it was unconstitutional or incompatible with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. That is completely obvious. After all, to use just one of several arguments, someone can only be punished if they have been convicted of that punishment by an independent court. With a sanction, however, it is the case that before a court has been able to decide, the sanction has already been imposed and enforced against the person concerned. And that is why the EU argues that this is not a punishment. It is not a punishment, they say, but a preventive measure. It would be a preventive measure if one could accuse the sanctioned person of violating some legal interest through their conduct.
Verletze sie irgendein Rechtsgut. Und die Person dazu.
And in order to induce the person to stop this violation of the law, the sanction is imposed as a means of pressure. In the case of sanctions for Russian destabilization measures, it would have to look something like this. The EU would have to accuse the person concerned of engaging in conduct that was part of a Russian destabilization campaign, a destabilization operation. The person concerned would have to have aligned themselves with such a campaign directed by the Russian government. And then the sanction would be a means of pressure to get that person to stop and no longer take part in that Russian campaign.
Dieser russischen Kampagne zu beteiligen. Also das wäre im Prinzip
So, in principle, it would be conceivable to use that kind of pressure as a preventive measure. But in the cases we are dealing with, whether it is Doku, BO, or others, there is, in my view, a crucial requirement missing for it to be justified as a preventive measure. Legally, the situation is this. If a sanction is used as leverage to induce someone to stop unwanted behavior, then before the sanction is imposed, that person must first be asked to stop doing what, in the EU's view, they are supposed to stop doing. If that happened, the person would have the opportunity to stop the unwanted behavior and avoid the sanction.
Die Sanktion zu vermeiden. Und damit wäre die Sache dann erledigt. Und dann könnte
And that would settle the matter. The person concerned could then file a lawsuit without having been sanctioned, challenging the fact that they were ordered to stop that conduct under threat of sanctions. If that person believes they were allowed to do it, and that being forced to stop even violates their fundamental rights, then they could sue. But those affected do not have that option in the case of EU sanctions, because the EU does not first instruct them to refrain from doing something specific. They are not told in advance that they are going to be sanctioned. They are not heard. Instead, one day, they suddenly find themselves on the sanctions list.
stehen sie plötzlich auf der Sanktionsliste und sie erfahren das erst, wenn sie zur Bank gehen und Geld abheben.
And you only find out when you go to the bank and want to withdraw money because your account has been frozen. Then, when you make inquiries, you can read in the EU's official journal that it says you are on the sanctions list. So from a legal standpoint, I assess this as follows. If the EU sanctions an expression of opinion by claiming that this expression is connected to the Russian disinformation campaign, then this constitutes an interference with freedom of expression that cannot be justified. It cannot be justified, if only because there would be a less restrictive means of achieving the goal the EU wants to achieve. That goal, after all, is for the person to refrain from participating in this Russian disinformation campaign.
Sich an dieser russischen Desinformationskampagne zu beteiligen. Und das Ziel hätte die EU erreichen können.
And the EU could have achieved that goal if it had threatened this, making this or that statement and publishing it in this or that newspaper or on this or that internet platform that we classify as pro-Russian. And if you don't stop, you will be sanctioned. But since that doesn't happen, the individual has no way to avoid the sanctions. After all, they have no idea that what the EU accuses them of will be treated as grounds for sanctions.
Als Sanktionsgrund angesehen werden wird.
Dann ist die Behauptung,
So the EU's claim that the sanctions are a preventive measure is merely a pretext.
Maßnahme eine Schutzbehauptung.
Das kann man so sehen. Wenn es keine
You can see it that way. If it isn't a pretext, then in any case it's a measure that can't be justified on other grounds. But there are indications that it is in fact disguised punitive measures that simply aren't labeled as such.
verkappte Strafmaßnahmen handelt, die nur nicht als solche bezeichnet werden.
Die nicht als
That are not described as such because, under the rule of law, they would not actually hold up.
Bestand hätten, oder sehe ich
Weil
das
sie
falsch?
dann rechtsstaatlich keinen Bestand hätten, dann wäre es noch viel leichter.
Because then they would not hold up under the rule of law.
Aber auch als
It would be even easier to say that they do not hold up under the rule of law. But these sanctions also do not hold up as preventive measures, because even with preventive measures, the principle of specificity follows from the rule of law principle. That means, even if I impose sanctions for preventive reasons, they must be formulated in the relevant regulation with enough specificity that an individual has the opportunity to know in advance what to expect if they do something specific. And the sanctions under this regulation we are discussing are worded so vaguely in the regulation that, in my view, it is simply not possible to foresee all the possible scenarios and adjust one's behavior accordingly.
überschauen und sein Verhalten danach einzurichten. Man kann gar nicht, auch wenn man vorsichtig ist,
Even if you're careful, you simply can't avoid doing everything that might possibly result in a sanction. That is mainly because it doesn't just say that the person concerned must not engage in manipulating opinions. Another reason someone can be sanctioned, apart from manipulating opinions, is exerting influence. Well, what is exerting influence? Any expression of opinion is influence on the formation of public opinion. And if I publicly say anything about political matters, I am influencing public opinion. Of course, that alone can never be enough. But now it is combined with the protection of the legal interests named in the regulation.
den Schutz der Rechtsgüter, die in der Verordnung genannt sind. Es soll ja geschützt werden, die Sicherheit, die Souveränität.
What is supposed to be protected is the security and sovereignty of states in the EU and in third countries, and so on. So it has to involve something that is connected, on the one hand, to a Russian destabilization campaign intended to affect and undermine security and sovereignty and so forth. And on the other hand, the person expressing an opinion has to be linked in some way to that Russian campaign. What could that link consist of? For example, if someone is actively involved, perhaps being paid as an agent by the Russian government to place certain disinformation online.
Bestimmte Desinformationen im Internet unterzubringen, das wäre ja noch relativ klar erkennbar und überschaubar.
That would still be relatively clear and manageable, but that is not the point. Now, that too is of course subject to sanctions under the regulation. But many other forms of conduct are sanctioned as well. For example, supporting such a disinformation campaign, or even merely facilitating it. And when we talk about facilitating, that is a term with such a broad scope that it covers almost anything at all, any critical expression of opinion against EU policy, or any statement that in any way expresses even the slightest understanding for aspects of Russian policy.
That suggests that sanctions are an instrument of a new arbitrary system of rule.
In any case, it is an instrument of domination. It is being used to push out of public discussion everything related to issues that matter to the EU and to EU foreign policy that calls EU narratives into question or that in any way even partially favors counter-narratives. And one can say that this is probably the purpose of these sanctions. At the Federal Press Conference, the spokesperson for the Foreign Office of the Federal Republic really warned the journalists who were present there. If anyone dares to express opinions like those expressed, for example, by Jacques Bode, then they have to expect that they too will end up on the list, that the same thing will happen to them as happened to Jacques Bode. This threat is intentional. Jacques Bode is someone who certainly expresses views that run completely counter to the mainstream here. You can shake your head at them if you want, and perhaps consider them far-fetched. But legally, this is the situation. Freedom of expression, as a fundamental right, also protects opinions that people consider far-fetched. That is precisely the core of freedom of expression. That even opinions hardly anyone agrees with are protected as a fundamental right, and above all, opinions the government does not agree with. And what the EU is doing here with these sanctions is in effect trying to push out of public discourse all views on the conflict in Ukraine in particular, but also on other issues the EU considers politically important if those views contradict the EU's narratives. And that is not only incompatible with freedom of expression, but also with the principle of democracy. Because democracy can only function if criticism of the government and criticism of EU institutions as well is allowed.
Jacques Bode is a former officer in the Swiss military intelligence service. He spent a great deal of time abroad, including in war zones and crisis areas, and now lives in Brussels. A Swiss citizen is being sanctioned in Brussels. As you say, he can no longer travel. How sound is the EU's justification?
As far as I've been able to ascertain, there are no compelling reasons to believe that Bode is cooperating with Russia in any way. In my view, that would be a prerequisite for sanctions to even be considered. Anyone who merely expresses opinions without cooperating with Russia in any way cannot be sanctioned by EU bodies simply because the content of those opinions is now seen as disruptive. That would clearly be incompatible with freedom of expression. There has to be something beyond the expression of opinion in order for that freedom of expression to be restricted in this context. And it would go beyond merely expressing opinions if there were, in fact, a conscious and deliberate alignment with a Russian disinformation campaign. The Council of the European Union would have to prove that in order to sanction someone like Jacques Bode. I have not seen that proof.
Bode says he does not work with Russian media, nor does he rely on Russian sources or accounts. He cites only Western sources, yet he is still being sanctioned. Is this about creating fear in order to force others in the population into preemptive obedience?
That's one way to see it. The EU is, of course, trying to justify itself nonetheless when it comes to applying its own sanctions regulation, which requires a connection to Russia. The regulation itself says so. It's not just something I'm saying. It's written right there in the regulation. The wording in the regulation is so vague that using terms like facilitate or support, you can construct a case more easily when it's set up in several stages. Of course, the Council of the EU has no evidence whatsoever that Jacques Baude is working with any Russian entity. And now the Council argues that Baude works with pro-Russian media outlets, and it names several that are said to fit that description. One media outlet, whose name I can't recall at the moment, is one that the EU says is somehow receiving money from Moscow, or something like that. But Baude says he never worked with them at all. Rather, they simply republished interviews or statements he had given to other media outlets without asking him. So it can't be attributed to him. The Council of the EU argues, and this isn't even the point I'm getting at, that statements by him appeared in this pro-Russian outlet. Whether he agreed to that or not, they say, is irrelevant, because it appeared in a Russian propaganda outlet. I mean, it makes no sense, even in terms of the preventive function that sanctions are supposed to have. If I want to use a sanction to deter someone from doing something they have done and continue to do, then it makes no sense to impose that sanction for something they did not do at all. So if a media outlet, a Russia-friendly outlet, whatever you want to call it, uses his statements without his consent, then that is not something he himself did, nor something he could be deterred from doing through a sanction. So that argument does not hold.
Mithilfe einer Sanktion. Also dieses Argument zählt nicht. Oder ein anderes Beispiel.
Or another example, the Council of the European Union cites as alleged proof of cooperation with Russia and thus involvement in a Russian disinformation campaign the fact that Bob signed his own book at a bookstore, and this bookstore is supposedly pro-Russian. The claim that the bookstore is pro-Russian is based on the fact that another author, a Frenchman, or rather that this Frenchman's books, were sold in that bookstore, and that this Frenchman is on the sanctions list. Patrick Bob should have known that, and therefore should have known that it was a bookstore with ties to Russia. And for that reason, he supposedly should not have appeared there.
That seems really far-fetched. How do such arbitrary measures come about? Who takes the initiative?
As a rule, the initiative comes from one of the member states. That can happen directly. After all, every member state is represented on the Council by a member of its government. In this case, it is the Council of Foreign Ministers that imposes this kind of sanction. In practice, it will likely work like this. In the member state whose foreign minister submits the request, someone in the foreign ministry, perhaps there is a department specifically looking for cases that could lead to sanctions and making proposals. Some official prepares a briefing for the minister, and the minister then takes it up. It is also possible that a state approaches the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, who can then bring the request before the Council as well.
Can one say that German foreign ministers who have sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution are helping in Brussels to undermine that Constitution?
I believe that ministers who take part in decisions by the EU Council are bound by the fundamental rights set out in Germany's basic law, and they violate the basic law if they themselves submit a motion or even merely agree to a motion that is incompatible with the basic law, and that appears to be the case here.
What legal options do people affected by this, like Hüseyin Doğru or Jacques Baude, have to challenge it?
There is the option of filing an action for annulment with the European courts against being placed on the sanctions list. At first instance, the General Court of the European Union has jurisdiction. At second instance, the European Court of Justice would have jurisdiction.
What are the chances of success for lawsuits like these?
There have already been decisions in many cases. In sanctions cases, though, there have still been relatively few, if any, under this new sanctions regulation. There simply isn't much experience with it yet. Most lawsuits so far have been unsuccessful, in some cases for disappointing reasons. But there are also quite a number of cases in which lawsuits have succeeded.
Eine ganze Reihe von Fällen, in denen Klagen Erfolg hatten.
But there are also cases in which the EU Council imposed sanctions on the very same person again just a few days later.
Ja, und das ist zumindest dann
Yes, and that is problematic, at least when the new sanction is based on arguments or conduct that are supposed to justify the sanction, and that fall within the same period the court has already reviewed. I think that going forward, the courts should say that this is an abuse, because it basically completely undermines legal protection if you can simply keep coming up with new reasons from some inexhaustible pool. When it comes to journalists, there are thousands of statements the person in question may have made at some point.
Tausende von Stellungnahmen, die der Betreffende mal gemacht hat. Da kann man immer wieder was Neues ausgraben. Und ich
You can always dig up something new. But I think that once a specific period has been investigated, the allegations against the person concerned should be exhausted. Of course, it can happen that, after the most recent court ruling, or after the period the court has assessed, new conduct emerges. Let's say someone who had not previously worked for the Russian government enters into some kind of contractual relationship and receives money from the Russian government. That new conduct could possibly justify a sanction. That's different. But to keep coming up with new reasons for the same period, again and again, I consider that highly problematic.
Das halte ich für sehr problematisch.
Der Ministerrat der EU.
The EU Council of Ministers is part of the executive branch. It is the emissaries of the national governments, the ministers, who make the decisions. But at the same time, those ministers impose sanctions with the force of law, thereby usurping legislative powers.
Sich damit legislative Befugnisse an. Wird hier die Gewaltenteilung aufgehoben?
The separation of powers is not applied consistently in the EU. The Council of the European Union, on the one hand, is a body made up of members of the national executive branches. It also makes decisions that can be assigned to the executive sphere. But under the EU treaties, it is also a legislative body. The EU legislature consists of two bodies, Parliament and the Council. In the past, it was only the Council. In the early phase of the European Economic Community, Parliament served only in an advisory capacity. Now it is, so to speak, an equal parliamentary body. But we have these two parliamentary, or rather legislative bodies, Parliament and the Council. And when it comes to the Council, the separation of powers is, so to speak, breached.
Sozusagen die Gewaltenteilung durchbrochen.
Dies ist ja nicht die einzige.
This is not the only measure by the European Union that is directed against the core foundations of the free democratic order. Take the Digital Services Act, for example, which is also capable of restricting freedom of expression.
Der ebenfalls geeignet ist, die Meinungsfreiheit einzuschränken.
Der Digital Services Act ist in der Tat.
The Digital Services Act is indeed very problematic in one respect. It also has useful provisions that are not legally objectionable and that are perfectly fine. For example, when it stipulates that users of internet platforms have certain rights to object if the platform does something that infringes on their rights. That is okay. But what I consider incompatible with freedom of expression is the fact that the Digital Services Act encourages internet platforms to delete what the EU considers disinformation, or what it considers harmful to political debate.
Für politische Debatten ist. Desinformation, wenn das nur
Disinformation. If this were only about preventing deliberate false information, in other words, lies on the internet, then from the standpoint of freedom of expression, it would be relatively unproblematic. But in this context, the EU uses a very broad definition of disinformation. It also includes misinformation, inaccurate information, as one might translate it. Misinformation is information given in good faith. It may be one-sided, not entirely objective. And that is something that is, so to speak, constitutionally protected within the framework of freedom of expression. No one is required, when speaking publicly, to be completely objective and to present every aspect of the matter they are discussing equally. It is quite common, even in so-called quality media, to present matters one-sidedly.
Und wenn man nur die halbe Wahrheit über einen bestimmten Vorgang sagt, dann sagt
And if you tell only half the truth about a particular event, then you're not telling the truth. You're misleading the audience in some way. And yet, if this isn't truly deliberate, manipulative disinformation, but rather simply a consequence of the journalistic business, not researching everything around it, then that is protected by freedom of expression. And if all of that gets filtered out because the EU considers it harmful to public debate, then what gets filtered out is not what is somehow one-sided, but what contradicts the EU's narratives.
sondern was den Narrativen der EU widerspricht. Und da die EU
And because the EU is not allowed to filter out such expressions of opinion itself, because that would be an exercise of sovereign authority, an unjustifiable infringement on freedom of expression, the EU leaves this filtering of what it considers undesirable to the internet platforms. And it does not just leave it to them. At the same time, it puts pressure on them to do what the EU itself is not allowed to do. And I consider this way of circumventing the protection of freedom of expression by indirectly pressuring internet companies to do what the state or the EU itself is not allowed to do, to be very detrimental to free debate on political issues.
verhängnisvoll für den freien Diskurs über politische Themen.
Im Zusammenhang mit dem Digital Services Act.
In connection with the Digital Services Act, there was a hearing in the U.S. Congress. The heads of major internet companies, such as Facebook, were questioned there. They also had to provide internal documents. The result is that the European Union intervened in a censorious way in 8 elections within the EU and manipulated public opinion. What do you make of that? Are we living in an age of censorship, as the U.S. Congress has found?
Der Zensur, wie es der US-Congress festgestellt hat?
Also da kenne ich jetzt die Hintergründe nicht näher. Ich müsste mir da
Well, I don't know the background in detail. I'd have to look at the reasoning and see exactly what was determined. What I have personally seen is that, during the COVID pandemic, governments put pressure on internet companies. As I have read, the German government was involved as well, not just the American government. And these millions of deletions of expressions of opinion that disagreed with COVID policy and COVID measures, that is something that really happened. And I believe that freedom of speech was very seriously impaired at that time.
dass damals die Meinungsfreiheit sehr schwerwiegend beeinträchtigt worden ist.
Welche Rolle spielen in
What role do state-funded or state-co-funded so-called non-governmental organizations such as Hate Aid play in this process?
wie beispielsweise Hate Aid?
Die wirken ihrerseits auf die Internetkonzerne ein, indem
They, in turn, influence the internet companies by filing reports. In Germany, we have the bad practice of reporting portals, where unwanted expressions of opinion can be reported on all kinds of topics, even when they fall below the threshold of criminal liability. These NGOs often pass along reports they receive from individual citizens to the internet platforms. So-called trusted flaggers play a special role in this. These are NGOs that have been certified by the responsible national authority. That means the authority determines that a particular organization, such as Hate Aid, meets the criteria under the DSA for an organization to qualify as a trusted flagger.
DSA als Trusted Flagger qualifiziert. Und diese Trusted Flagger
And these trusted flaggers have more influence than other organizations over what internet companies delete, because under the DSA, internet companies are required to give priority to reports from trusted flaggers.
vorrangig zu bearbeiten.
And it always comes down to time. If an organization, if a trusted flagger, claims that a report, an internet post that they consider unlawful, is present, then the internet platform in question has to respond very quickly. I don't remember the exact time frame, but I assume it has to decide on deletion within 1 day.
Die Entscheidung über die Löschung treffen. Die Entscheidung liegt bei der
The
Internetplattform.
decision lies with the online platform, so they are not legally required to delete everything a trusted flagger reports. But they themselves are under time pressure and under pressure from perhaps thousands of reports coming in. They have to make decisions quickly. And for the online platform, the easiest thing is to delete when in doubt, rather than decide in favor of freedom of expression when in doubt. Because if something is deleted unjustly, that has no downside for the internet company. But if it is not deleted, and a national authority later determines that it should have been deleted because it was illegal, then that can have serious negative consequences for the internet company if it happens repeatedly. If it happens only once, nothing happens. If it happens more often, the EU may say they have not done enough to address systemic risks, and therefore they receive a large fine.
Systemische Risiken getan und deshalb kriegen sie ein hohes Bußgeld.
Bei ihrem Gipfel in Vilnius 2023.
At its summit in Vilnius in 2023, NATO decided as part of its cognitive warfare to strengthen cooperation with the EU in combating disinformation. A year later, the European Union said that so-called disinformers, while defining for itself what that means, have effectively been declared enemies of the state. Is NATO pulling the strings behind the scenes?
Zieht die NATO im Hintergrund die Strippen?
Das weiß ich nicht genau. Mir scheint es naheliegend.
I don't know that exactly. It seems plausible to me, but I don't have enough information about what joint consultations or joint decisions there may have
welche
been.
gemeinsamen Beratungen, welche gemeinsamen Beschlüsse es da gegeben hat.
Sie haben vorhin erwähnt, dass die Europäische Union und die Europäische
Earlier, you mentioned that the European Union and the European Commission in particular link the fight against disinformation and the sanctions to the war in Ukraine. Is this part of warfare? Will we soon be banned from listening to enemy broadcasts?
Haben wir demnächst ein Verbot, Feindsender zu hören?
Ja, zu hören nicht, also das wäre
Yes, not by listening. That kind of ban would probably not be legally enforceable in Germany or in the EU. But everything is being done to make sure we no longer even have the opportunity. RT has been banned in the European Union since the start of the war in Ukraine. That was also done as a sanction, by the way, but under a different sanctions regulation. RT and Sputnik, as business entities, were simply placed on a special list, and they were given a broadcasting ban in the EU. You can understand that as a kind of countermeasure against Russia's hybrid warfare. At least that's how the EU sees it. If the EU says that Russia is engaging in hybrid warfare, including through influence via the media, and is allowing state media to operate here in Europe, then one could say, well, the EU is now defending itself through hybrid warfare as well, and as a countermeasure, it is imposing a broadcasting ban.
Und als Gegenmaßnahme wird jetzt ein Sendeverbot erlassen.
Anfang der 80er Jahre habe ich an der Universität
In the early 1980s, I studied political science at the University of Mannheim, and in advanced seminars and graduate seminars, it was entirely normal, and professors actually encouraged it, to borrow a dissertation written at the Institute for Marxism-Leninism of the Central Committee of the Socialist Unity Party in East Berlin, just to see how they argued and how they linked ideology with factual issues. You could also read communist newspapers, like UZ, or whatever else. Any publications from East Germany. Do they seriously want to ban that? Are they trying to cure the devil with Beelzebub?
Verbieten, will man da den Teufel mit dem Beelzebub austreiben?
Ich meine auch in einer freien Gesellschaft soll
I also believe that in a free society, the government should consider its citizens mature and responsible enough to recognize propaganda and deal with it themselves. And in fact, as you just put it, you have to understand your opponent's line of argument if you want to fight it effectively. That's worth considering. Of course, there are a number of arguments the EU has now raised against you.
entgegengehalten wurden. Die argumentieren ja zum Beispiel, dass im Rahmen der hybriden
For example, they argue that in the context of hybrid warfare, the other side, the enemy, as it is now called, doesn't make itself easy to identify. Instead, it operates in much more sophisticated ways. This propaganda uses methods aimed first of all at undermining the public's trust in its own media, and so on. So the example of obtaining literature that clearly states the other side's position and studying it can't be transferred one-to-one to the means of conflict in hybrid warfare. That would certainly be the argument put to you from the EU side, and it can't entirely be dismissed.
Kein Richter kann seine Arbeit.
No judge can do their job if they take it seriously without hearing both sides. No journalist can do their job if they take it seriously without hearing both sides. So I do feel that the European Union is obstructing me in the practice of my profession.
Union an meiner Berufsausübung gehindert.
Ja, jetzt gehindert wodurch? Also, Sie haben ja also
Yes, prevented from doing what exactly? As a journalist, you still have the option of obtaining Russian media from Russia or receiving Russian channels in Europe as far as their signal reaches. With a ban on RT, the EU is trying to prevent Russia from influencing the broader population. As I said, if you view the whole thing as hybrid warfare, then it may be possible to justify it as a countermeasure. I can't say any more about that.
Als Gegenmaßnahme rechtfertigen. Mehr kann ich da nicht dazu sagen. Ich persönlich würde das nicht, finde
Personally, I don't think it's good that this is being done, because I truly believe that people who are interested in politics and want to inform themselves should also be able to get information from sources on the other side, even with the risk involved. But everyone does that knowing that pure truth is not being proclaimed there, just as it isn't. And we have to be honest about this, on the Western side either. The West also produces narratives that aren't entirely objective. Russia probably does this to a greater extent, but everyone who looks into the matter knows that.
Aber das weiß doch auch jeder, der sich damit befasst.
Wie können wir unter diesen
How can we save democracy under these conditions? What can be done to remedy this situation when faced with a political elite, government officials, and politicians who have imposed such sanctions?
die solche Sanktionen eingeführt haben?
Ich sehe eigentlich, wenn uns die Rechtsprechung
As I see it, if the courts don't help us, and I hope they will, at least in cases like Jacques Baude's, and I believe they should help us in cases like Dogrow's as well. Based on my legal analysis, this sanctions regulation, as such, violates the rule of law, and everyone sanctioned under this regulation should prevail in the proceedings they bring before the European Court. We'll see what comes of it. If that doesn't succeed, then really the only option left is to go through the public.
bleibt eigentlich nur der Weg über die Öffentlichkeit. Ich sehe bis jetzt kaum in
So far, I see very little indication in German media or in the media of other EU countries that this problem is even being recognized to any extent. Aside from a few alternative media outlets, or for example the Swiss publication Weltwoche, which has published quite a lot on the subject. Otherwise, it is still receiving far too little attention. But it is time, especially for journalists, to see just how explosive this issue is and how quickly it can spread. So far, we have only a handful of cases involving European journalists on the sanctions list. But this could become a wildfire if it is not stopped.
wenn hier nicht Einhalt geboten wird.
Der Staatsrechtler Professor
Constitutional law professor Dietrich Murswiek says, all the sanctions imposed by the EU violate the rule of law, and there could be a widespread conflagration if the public, including journalists and legal professionals, does not wake up. Thank you very much for that.
nicht erwachen. Dafür vielen Dank.
Certainly.
Wir bei Gegen den
Here on Against the Current, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about. Stay with us.
Bleiben Sie dabei.